Welcome back after a very long absence to the B2B Uncut podcast. I am still your host, Aaron Sheehan, with Oro Commerce, who helpfully sponsors and distributes this podcast. We have to make up for the long absence of not having any content. I'm so sorry. And there are reasons for that. And people have been beaten to atone for that error in judgment. But to make up for that, I am joined by Heather Hershey, who should need no introduction, but we're going to give her a chance to do it anyway, because that's always helpful. But Heather and I have known each other for some years. I would say she is ubiquitous on LinkedIn, like so many people are. And I would describe her as one of the sharper tools in the shed, but I will let her introduce herself to you. Heather, who are you and why should people care what you have to say?
Oh, great question, Aaron. Thank you for inviting me on the pod. I'm Heather Hershey. I'm an analyst from a tier one analyst firm. If you want to figure out which one, please go to my LinkedIn profile, Heather Hershey 1 on LinkedIn. But just so you know, what I'm about to say on this podcast is a reflection of my own opinions. So that comes with all the biases that would imply, but is not a reflection of my employer. All right, caveat over. My background is really complex, but like a lot of analysts before me, this path led to an interesting place where I'm talking to line of business people about IT things and vice versa. So in my life, I am a former commerce professional, former AI researcher. I went to UGA for AI for a master's. My actual emphasis was in natural language programming and sentiment analysis, which has moved very, very far beyond what it was back in 2013 when I was in my master's program. So I'm dating myself as a very old millennial. And I write about commerce, agentic commerce, B2B commerce, how B2C commerce platforms are not always the greatest fit for B2B commerce, and topics of that nature. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to be on my soapbox for a moment there.
Oh, I love that, and it's a theme that, of course, resonates very strongly with us over at Oro. And so we were talking, about what do we want to discuss, and it felt like to kick off 2026 on the heels of NRF, National Retail Federation. It's a big tech and commerce event that takes place in New York every January in the cold wind. That show is often a kind of a kickoff for what's the theme of the year going to be, and I think it's AI. I think that may be the theme. And so I thought, well, who better to sort of introduce us and have a spicy conversation about what is true, what is not true, what is AI really, and helping make sense of that for folks in the manufacturing and distribution space who are absolutely bombarded with ferocious claims right now from lots of ends. What is going on? So I think maybe let's start with some definition of terms. I have three terms I want you to define for our audience. We'll start with an easy one. What's AI?
Oh gosh, you would think this would be an easy one, but it's not really because the problem is that AI has been around for a very long time. So of course it stands for artificial intelligence, and what that means can either be incredibly figurative or incredibly literal, depending on that interpretation. So I think some of this is kind of generational bias in a way, but it's also just a matter of how pedantic do we want to be? Because I mean, if this concept has been around for almost an entire century at this point, it kind of does speak to the fact that, everyone's going to have some stake in it. We've seen many, many waves of it. In general, it's any time a machine can approximate something that a human would otherwise be doing manually. And as these processes become more digitized, more philosophical questions about what that entails start to creep into the mix. So it becomes more of an issue of what is intelligence, right? So there's a lot of philosophy. It's multidisciplinary. If you're a researcher like I was, it can involve social science, it can involve psychology, a lot of computer science, hardcore logic. It's kind of an amalgam of all of these things because the goal is to try to approximate human intelligence. And human intelligence, again, it's a very subjective sort of thing. And is human-like intelligence even the goal anymore? Like, if you talk to someone who's really advocating for something like ASI, for example, obviously,
You've introduced another acronym. You weren't supposed to do that. Not till the end.
Okay, sorry. But yeah, like literally, if what you want is a superior intelligence, right? Then what you're basically assuming by default is that intelligence is not bound to something that looks like something a human can do. So AI in general is all these things and more. In the old school definition, it could have been a workflow engine, right? Like it could be something pretty basic with some if-then triggers. But by some people's standards, that bar is significantly higher. And if it's not a machine that's literally doing all the thinking and all the execution, then it's not really AI.
Right. Got it. So starting with the calculator and kind of the trusty TI-80 and moving its way kind of up the food chain a little bit. So is AI the same thing as an LLM then?
Well, an LLM is a flavor of AI. So you've got AI, which again can be incredibly basic. It's this big nebulous umbrella that could mean essentially everything and nothing all at once, which is why it's so horrible to use as a marketing term because it means, again, nothing. But you drill down and you notice that there are different flavors of it. For example, machine learning, right? Machine learning, ML, is basically when you get a machine to train itself, right? And one of the ways it does this is through neural nets. If you use a lot of neural nets to do more complex calculations of this nature, then you get what's called deep learning. An LLM is built upon this deep learning technology. So what an LLM is doing is all of this and more on a much larger scale. It's taking in literally billions of parameters of data, mainly in the form of words or code. It's good to remember that an LLM, by design, is meant to do something that communicates. The whole point of the exercise is that it communicates. So, frankly, I think, just a little side note, that we should consider like using LLM when we're talking to IT or people who actually have to work within these models or really directly with them, but use NLP, natural language processing, when we are talking to marketers and people who are only interfacing with the chat. Because the whole point of LLMs is that they enable NLP.
Got it. Okay. Well, that makes a certain amount of sense to me. Of course, we've had NLP around for quite some time, so that's not particularly new and sexy.
No,
Um,
but it's a very sophisticated way of doing it.
that's fair. We strive to be accurate on this podcast, to inform and to entertain at the same time. So, what I have heard, how I have heard LLMs described is they are basically predictive text guessers in a certain way. They're models. This deep learning that you speak of is trying to sort of almost type ahead and guess like what's the next at a very, very sort of like very simplified level. What's the next character that makes mathematical sense probabilistically in completing or answering this sentence? I have also heard the term RAG to sort of describe the process of tuning or interacting with the LLM. Walk us through what RAG is, and then we're gonna stop at the acronyms and get into the, like, unfounded opinions, but, like, let's go.
Yeah, okay, so RAG is retrieval augmented generation. So again, what LLMs are doing is that they're generating content, code, language, right? So you can either use that public model, ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever's available. You can develop your own models using like Hugging Face or something like that. Or you could buy software or some other thing that enables you to take your own data sources and securely use that within the context of the model. So that way, when the model is trying to figure out what the next best word or phrase is, it's literally matching it to information that you have in your own existing systems and have control over, and is a little bit more proprietary and specific.
Got it. That makes sense. So, a lot of our customers here, a lot of our listeners, I expect, are manufacturers, and I think about, like, an error rate on a production line, like a 1% error rate on a production line would be actually pretty awful, for a manufacturer. Like, that's a lot of waste. That's a lot of rework. That's a lot of wasted material and time and, and really, like, capacity. But if an LLM is fundamentally probabilistic, how do you reconcile sort of like technology that's kind of based around guessing with an industry like ours that requires a lot more certainty, I suppose?
Huh. I don't know if agentic AI is a comfortable fit for a lot of things that need to be done within the context of B2B commerce. Because, I think about things like EDI, for example, right? Like, and I've made this argument many, many times. EDI hasn't gone away, and we've all heard of mechanisms that have tried to kill it. I've often heard the debate about, why EDI and not APIs, et cetera, right? When they do fundamentally slightly different things, right? I think that the reason why EDI and technologies of that nature persist is because they're secure, right? Because, there isn't a lot of unknown going on there. It's very easily auditable and traceable, and it accommodates really high volume transactions. We don't know a lot of that stuff about agentic AI when it comes to B2B payments at this point, right? So that's just one example of how this touches commerce. But when we're talking about these LLMs, they are the biggest of possible black boxes. And you basically have to take it on faith when they tell you what it is that they're doing. And that's just going to be an uncomfortable fit any way you swing it.
Yeah, that makes a certain amount of sense. And certainly we at Oro use LLM integrations into the platform to accomplish very specific outcomes, but they're very bounded and very trained, and focused on very specific problem sets and workflows that need to be automated or need to be evaluated. I think there's a large difference between AI and I'll say LLM because it's more precise to your earlier point. An LLM that is completely making decisions on its own. This is sort of the agentic kind of like concept, and an agent that is helping a person accomplish something complicated on their own, but there is a person continually engaged. And I think a little bit about this is kind of the size matter question a little bit. It's the large language model. But as you pointed out, we've had NLP, we've had machine learning, we've had algorithms, another fun word that we didn't define for a really long time. Like a really, really long time. Obviously, I mean, algorithms have been around for, depending on how you want to define it, centuries. Is an LLM overkill then compared to sort of like boring machine learning, which is sort of like a very rules based system? And what's are you seeing a lot of repackaging of machine learning into generative AI and LLMs? And should we actually be a little relieved by that? Because what that means is that means the technology is actually boring and trustworthy. It's just being gussied up by the marketing people. Is that a fair way to think of it?
Yes, to a certain extent, there's a profound amount of agent washing that I'm witnessing, right? And the thing is, I wanna do two things. One, I wanna circle back to something that you mentioned because I forgot to answer it directly. Was the bit about the smaller models? I'm a huge fan of distillation. It's less resource intensive and it works very quickly. You can stand up those models very quickly compared to the parent, whatever that may be. So I think that yes, there's definitely a place for smaller models that may be specifically purpose built for industries, and particular use cases that are not quite so broad and generalized. Because that's kind of the problem with the LLMs. They're incredibly generalized by default because they're all these companies are in the pursuit of AGI, artificial general intelligence, and there's this assumption that if they just build bigger models with more data and more parameters that they will be able to achieve that goal someday. Whether or not that's true is an entirely different thing. But here's the thing: a lot of that stuff is very cool and very buzzy and gets a lot of attention with the investor class. But I feel like professionals in commerce, particularly folks who are where the rubber meets the road, they're in fulfillment or something like that. Hardcore ops where not every part of it is digitized or can be digitized. They're sitting there going, what's in this for me? What does any of this have to do with my day to day? And I think that boring AI is very useful. Workflows are great for most parts of B2B commerce that at least that I'm aware of. You don't have to go back through and cleanse every single bit of the data that your organization has ever produced in its entire history in order to leverage it, right? And you have more control. And I think that that's really more to the point. When you are considering adding anything agentic or that has this LLM technology to what you're doing in commerce, remember what it's there for, right? Like it's there to help you communicate. So in the case of having the chat interface on the operational side, it's to help you interface with operations or like different parts of the commerce platform or whatever software you're working in. But on the customer side, right, it's to help them, whether that's with IT self-service or it's with, finding the right product, configuring products, maybe even someday, things like that, right? Like those are all things that could potentially be done through chat. And then you have to ask yourself the next logical step. Would it make sense for someone to engage with a chatbot instead of just the UI? And if you can't answer that question definitively, maybe an LLM is overkill.
Yeah, but they're so cheap. They're so
Sure, sure.
yeah. Well, that was that was me being facetious, but I think yeah. So the technical reality that we see on our end is that for a lot of our customers and folks in our orbit, in manufacturing, distribution, supply, wholesale, anyone kind of in that end of the supply chain, there's all of this sort of like cutting edge AI buzz about LLMs, but where the sort of center of percussion is for a lot of these businesses is an ERP, often an old ERP with a green screen or a mainframe of some kind, or just maybe it is like it's S4 or an old version of like Great Plains or something like that on the accounting side. And then after years and years of merger and acquisition, what you actually have is now like lots of sources of truth about very specific pieces of data. And what we've seen is a lot of folks, because B2B is often run by the finance and ops folks. And so reporting is kind of like the change agent, I guess, enforcing like a data lake or data warehouse to be built that says, okay, we're going to take all of the little contained silos that we have acquired and still operate across all of these different lines of business. We're going to pour their contents into some kind of normalized data lake. That's going to be we're going to use that as an insights and reporting engine. We're going to put a reporting engine on it and use that to generate insights, compliance, and all that kind of stuff. What's the technical reality of trying to put an AI agent that does communication on top of a constellation of disconnected systems like that? Because that's been the goal for the last few years is best of breed, right? We have very specific point solutions that do very specific things. Maybe they're really modern, but they're the best in breed and there's some kind of glue that holds them all together, but don't worry about that. They're really good separately and or you've just inherited that organically over time because you buy a distributor here, you buy a distributor there. Next thing you know, you got a bunch of distributors. You've got a bunch of ERPs. What happens when you try to take an LLM and stick it in that construct and more, I think, practically, what do you have to do if you're in business and you need to like figure out where to put the LLM? Where do you start with something like that? Because your data is so fragmented.
Yeah, that's really rough, honestly. And there's actually a pretty huge market of startups, for example, that are trying to create these intermediary layers for exactly this sort of thing. And I've seen this, in various flavors, whether it's looking at this from a systems integration sort of perspective and how to harness all that data. But I mean, that's even putting the cart before the horse a little bit too, because that's assuming that that data can even be used by that agent in some way, and that it isn't redundant, et cetera. It's a complex thing. I think this is a lot of what I view is going on with the agentic AI push because, as you notice, when I try to reframe LLM as NLP, it becomes a little less sexy, right? Like that is kind of what I've been doing as Captain Wet Blanket on some of these biggie.
You have t-shirts.
Yeah, yeah, but it's like there's a lot of buzz meant to generate hype for various reasons from various companies. That's cool. There's a lot of profound utility in doing what you've just described, Aaron, but the way to get there is unfortunately usually the same route that you've been hearing anytime a big push towards digital transformation hits the scene. And this is one of those things, right? Just like the metaverse, just like COVID, right? Like if you were a holdout, you have to, get a firm, an SI, somebody enabled to help you kind of um get all of your data right, and that way you can create the data layer required to leverage this technology properly. And what you plan to do with it dictates how big the scope of that actually is. If you're trying to do this across multiple ERPs simultaneously, that's a big deal. And the thing is, it gets more expensive every year. So, like, if you have been holding off on that, that's going to continue to be a problem. I would suggest that one thing though that I've pretty much been a advocate for since the beginning is if you can find software that can help you take chunks of that at a time and rationalize it to leverage AI in very specific ways, like for customer service or something like that. That's really helpful, right? And you can use that in tandem with the strangler pattern to decouple your ERP if you want, and you don't want to do a whole rip and replace of that system because it's painful. But you don't have to go that far. You can also buy one of these apps that acts as an intermediary layer to create kind of that source of truth that the AI can then leverage for its processes.
Yeah, and for those listeners who are like, "What on earth is a strangler pattern?" That is, I'm gonna butcher this a little bit, but it is effectively a software design pattern where when you have a big system that does a lot of things, you start snipping off little pieces of it and giving that little piece to a better system to go do, so that over time, slowly, your giant behemoth of an IT stack becomes more decentralized and you are less dependent basically on one central database and one central application. It's named after the strangler fig, I believe.
Yes.
Um, and we can talk about that plenty. I think one of this is as an aside. I would like to get your reaction to this statement. And rest assured, if you give the right answer, we will probably use it in some vertical video on LinkedIn after this publishes.
Nice.
Yeah, yeah. So no pressure. What we see is that in B2B, we'll call it e-commerce, digital commerce. That's not necessarily the right word for it, but let's say an e-commerce platform often ends up as that orchestration layer of bringing context to a lot of disconnected data. They connect orders, transactions, financial records, inventory, product data, customer master records, user tables, like a single sign on, quote history, customer service requests, returns, warranties, all of this stuff that is often there's bits of that customer experience sort of just like all over the floor, like you had just a bunch of dogs shedding everywhere. You've got a living room, you got shag carpet, there is fur everywhere, and kind of like that's kind of where the data is. And e-commerce platforms in B2B are often the new sexy thing, but because they sort of sit on top of all of those back office systems and are then used by buyers, customers, and internal teams, they become the sort of like aggregator of all of that information and then become the natural place to put an LLM interface or a better NLP for natural language interface or boring old machine learning to generate predictive insights. Have you seen the same thing? Would you agree or disagree with that?
I 100% agree with that statement.
That's amazing. LinkedIn is so happy.
So that's why I mentioned the strangler pattern because I'm like a broken record. I mention it all the time, but I think that it's kind of easy to interpret from how bearish I have been in previous sections of this conversation regarding the hype of AI. That doesn't mean that I don't think it has utility. And in commerce, there are plenty of places to put LLM technology that are of high value, right? Like, again, if you want to interface with the system to pull up analytic data on the fly, that's a great way to do it, right? If you're comfortable doing that with a chat interface. On the front end, again, I implore people to think about combining their IT help desk with the chat bot for customer success, customer service, whatever you're building on the front of your website, because you could use that repository of data to seamlessly go from so you have to have knowledge bases for both, right? Is what I'm saying. You could use those repositories of information seamlessly within the same interface, kind of like how Google combined their search bars back in the day. So you could just use one to rule them all, right? That way you're not developing a bunch of chatbots all over the place, all using different sources of truth because you have to manage all those and update them, right? It gives you the opportunity to kind of consolidate some of the ways that you interface with your customers on the front end through an actual novel interface, that the chatbot. So there are many ways that you can configure that, but that's just one example of how this can be leveraged in a novel way.
Exactly. It's a great use case for a customer portal where the customers can see their order history, which means the portal has to then know the full order history, then can raise a ticket or have an interaction about items in those orders. And then there's full visibility around that. Also, bonus points, Heather, for using the word seamlessly twice in that explanation. You are ready for a career in product marketing, should you so choose, at least in SaaS or sewing. Okay. So let's say you're the CTO of a modern distributor and you have to spend $100,000 on AI to satisfy the board, but you actually want to see a return on that. Where would you put your money?
Two things. One, I would probably focus on security first. And that's not super sexy, right? Because it's not splashy, but I think it's
I said
necessary.
see a return, Heather, not flush it down the toilet.
No, the thing is, this is so important because as agents get more sophisticated, we can't assume that only good faith actors are going to have access to them. I definitely see an uptick of this, and there is more concern about it. And the thing is that it goes hand in hand with enabling more of it for your own use, right? Because you would want to put more security in place and guardrails for what you're doing with your own data, but you want to make sure that whatever you're doing isn't also going to expose it to more bad faith actors in the process. So things like detecting when a bot, like an agentic procurement bot, for example, is trying to interface with your website or your agents as opposed to a human. That's going to be good information for the future. But I don't think investing in that right now is as important as just laying the groundwork for the security apparatus that would enable that kind of pattern recognition later down the road. And then I do think that sales enablement would probably be a really great place
Ooh.
with this. You know, like guided sales, something of that nature, something that really kind of streamline some of those processes so customers don't have to sit there and wait for 2 days before, a sales rep gets back to them via email. That'd be great.
Well, and that's always been the promise of e-commerce, but a lot of times in B2B, you still have a sort of a complex RFQ. Somebody emails an RFP because they have a project they're bidding on, and they're like, "Here's a spreadsheet full of stuff. Get back to me." Speed kills deals. If you take too long to respond to that RFP or that request, they may have moved on to a competitor at that point. So I totally hear you. Gartner has been talking about digital sales rooms for some time. Guided selling, of course, is a big topic there. And it's something that you see a lot in manufacturing, especially that we see, which is a lot of guided selling for the sales reps to use in a CPQ tool, but they're rarely customer facing. And so there's still this sort of like asynchronous workflow involved where a person still has to spend the time to deconstruct that spreadsheet and turn it into a bill of materials with a quote on it. And that is a great use case for AI. I agree. I think we will probably see some interesting stories on the security side of this, probably in 2026, where bad actors are using agents to go and try to gamify commerce. I think, actually, as you were talking, I was reminded of a conversation I have had, I don't know how many times over the last 15 years around SEO, which is part of the company wants to keep the catalog under lockdown. You got to have a login and a password to see the products and all. We can't let Google see our product. I don't care about SEO. Our customers know who we are. They'll find us. They don't need our,
Mm.
they don't need to, the web doesn't need to know what we sell. Right. And then they'll like, oh, but the web does need to know because people won't find us unless they're looking for a specific product. They'll start with the product and then they'll find their way to us and then they'll request a quote and then they'll become a customer. That the sort of the two orbits of that. Really, agentic commerce, any kind of agent or crawler is following a very similar path that a Google bot is following for SEO purposes. So maybe we're going to reignite that debate inside the boardrooms of, let's say, large distributors. Do we lock everything down to prevent? We're preventing e-procurement bots, but we're also preventing Google and we're preventing people. But we're safer, or maybe we'll open it up and then we'll have to invest. We'll have to take that $50,000, let's say, that Heather is spending on security to invest in countermeasures against bad actors. Well, so I guess to that end, then we should probably talk about the prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, yeah. This is something that you'll see most often in D2C, B2C commerce. And it's mainly related to what's going on with the large language platforms themselves. So your OpenAI, their ChatGPT. So Claude, maybe not so much, but you'll see it in Perplexity, ChatGPT, Gemini. They are basically, and Amazon to a certain extent too, are very much trying to brute force this motion where they disintermediate all of D2C e-commerce and basically just become one big marketplace aggregator to rule them all, where you shop through chatbot forever and ever and ever.
Okay, Shopify is doing this pretty explicitly now too.
Yeah, I have some issues with this. Namely, the example I like to use is thus why this value prop has a pretty glaring hole. I'm gonna hang out at night and just have Netflix on in the background, and I'm scrolling mindlessly, adding crap to my cart mindlessly. I might buy it. If they send me an email with a deal, I'll probably pull that trigger. But I'm mindlessly scrolling with very little direct intent, but I'm probably going to buy something. You have to have pretty strong intent to be able to communicate with a chatbot what it is that you actually want it to go buy on your behalf, which is the entire agentic commerce premise, right? That it's going to do your purchasing for you. And it can't do that without you instructing it on what you're looking for, at what price point, et cetera, et cetera. And you'll notice if you go into like Google's Gemini toolkit for agentic shopping, it's basically a workflow engine that you're using to basically trigger it to purchase things on your behalf based on certain criteria that you're setting out in advance. It's very deterministic, which again makes me question how agentic is all of that, right? Because agents do have deterministic elements, but they are by and large probability engines. But anyway, what you're leaving on the cutting room floor are all of these mindless scroll sessions from somebody who didn't actually want to read an essay. They just want to look at pretty pictures and add stuff to their cart. So, those impulse buys matter, right? And part of the problem with what's going on in the prisoner's dilemma concept is that for a lot of merchants, this sounds like a terrible idea, right? They may want to put chat interfaces on their website. That version of agentic commerce doesn't really offend them because they control it. But it is kind of out in left field for them to be completely cool with this disintermediation play and to give up most of top of funnel discovery, which was basically hijacked, whether they like it or not, by these answer engines. And then now mid funnel and commerce are up for grabs, apparently. And that's got some of them scratching their heads and going, why do we need to do this? Because inherently, even if they can't put their finger on why, it's because it is a prisoner's dilemma. What a prisoner's dilemma is in game theory is essentially you got two prisoners and they're being interrogated separately by separate cops. And they are told separately, here's the deal. If you rat out your partner, you go free. The thing is that they would both go free if they both kept their mouths shut.
So you're talking about basically two rational individuals having conflicting self-interest. It's in their interest to cooperate,
right,
at some level, but also not.
No, it's the thing is like the overlying logic is not in their favor to talk.
If we take anything away from this, it's that LLMs are going to be sending people to jail, and I think I fall back to the wisdom that my uncle Roscoe told me a long time ago, which is just never talk to the cops, and then you make the rational decision, the prisoner's dilemma. I'll leave it to your imagination, listeners, to decide to fill in the mental picture.
You're an entire Law and Order episode on top of this premise.
Yes. Excellent. But that'll be in the sequel, the follow-up to this episode, Heather. You don't know, but we're gonna do a little true crime.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Ripped from the headlines.
But that's it. The merchants know this isn't to their benefit, right? Because there might be a first adopter advantage, but that's evanescent, right? Because eventually, if enough people join, all it's going to really do is commoditize everything on the front end of commerce and turned most merchants into drop shippers for these LLM platforms.
I mean, laughs in Bezos. Like, this is a little bit. I think we've seen this particular play before, and bringing it back to B2B. Obviously, Amazon business has grown a lot and is doing quite well. I think one of the reasons for that is they have fulfillment centers, and OpenAI does not. And at the end of the day, there's a value proposition. There's a disintermediating going on, but there's also a value being delivered. And thus far, simply doing it with software, it does not do that. So you've mentioned agentic commerce a lot, and I haven't actually, really dug into what that means, and I don't even want to because it just makes my head hurt as to what the actual definition of agentic commerce is. I think it's fair to say that for it to be a useful term, it needs to be different. Agentic AI needs to be different from other forms of AI. And the implication of agentic is that it does stuff for you. It is acting as an agent on your behalf. It understands what your desires are, and it goes out and tries to make those desires come true. That may be, negotiating the best possible price for a particular product. It may be buying a bunch of stuff and then returning a bunch of stuff, things that are rational for it to do, but not in the best interest, obviously, of the distributor, let's say, who's having to like bear all that cost. So, what is your working model or definition of agentic commerce, and in B2B specifically? Because I've seen a lot of predictions around, well, agentic commerce is going to disrupt e-procurement. Agentic commerce is going to disrupt portals. It's going to disrupt EDI, sort of one of your earlier points. What is your prediction for how we'll be engaging with this term in the B2B world in the next 2 years? What is going to get disrupted significantly by agentic commerce?
See, I don't really know how much of this is gonna penetrate B2B because I definitely believe that the market, based on what I've seen, and especially validated after NRF and seeing, the scant handful of B2B vendors shying away from using agents in their go-to-market strategy at the event. I'm definitely of the opinion that my definition would still apply in a B2B context because I made it intentionally very, very broad and functional. So just to cut to the chase, my definition is essentially based on what is making the decisions when it comes to the purchase, the actual payment, and then the fulfillment, right? Now, not to say that every element of things like fulfillment need to be completely operated or that these things should be operating without guardrails or some kind of human oversight, but that the majority of the decision-making process is done by the AI itself via agentic means. And what that means on a technical level is that an agent is more than just a reasoning engine. It basically is leveraging the LLMs, usually multiple simultaneously, while it is leveraging pieces of software as tools, right? It's using those as tools. It's using all sorts of different things combined in this sort of multimodal way to run loops in pursuit of solving a problem, making a decision, et cetera, right? Like whatever it's been set to do, it's just going to keep looping and looping and looping until it determines probabilistically that it is come across the best answer and then uses the LLM technology to generate that answer. So I think that it's not necessarily the most intuitive fit for B2B, right? Because would you want an agent making the decision about the purchase, right? Like that is, the promise of a lot of what's going on in agentic procurement, right? Like I would argue that where that would be most beneficial are for repetitive purchases of known products. And in that case, maybe the purchasing decision isn't being done agentically as much as the modeling about the predictive aspects of what should be ordered, right? Like, so you kind of have to look at what is actually being decided upon and what role the agent is playing in here to kind of make sense of it. Because if you are just creating a workflow like what Google has come up with for its agentic B2C purchasing, but you just create something like that for procurement, that's still humans providing the logic, humans making the decision. If it's a situation where I have a checkout in a B2C context, that's not agentic because I'm still manually going through a regular e-commerce cart. And likewise, if I have to submit a purchase order, to a sales rep, I don't necessarily feel like there's much of anything agentic about that. So
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, for our product, we have a workflow, that handles that exact use case where a purchase order gets emailed to a sales rep and then automatically basically ingested through inbox integration, and then using OCR and an LLM reads that purchase order in and translates it into a digital clone basically of that purchase order, validates, and this is the important part, validates the guesses against what is on record for that customer. So is that ship to one that I've seen before on this particular account? Is this per line item price for that SKU accurate? Is that the right payment method? None of that is agentic in the sense of it is sort of like, you know, robot take the wheel, like it is making decisions about my business for me. It is an automated workflow where AI is being very specifically applied, I think. But there's still what the result of that workflow is a dashboard and a queue for a person to come in and review what's there and then make a correction. It is a quality of life and automation tool. It is not running your business for you, which is, I think, where some of the talk seems to be today. And I think a little bit about what you said around EDI, and now EDI is a standard.
yeah.
Fundamentally, it's just a standard of documentation. Now we have more standards for AI with Google's UCP and OpenAI's, was it ACP,
Yes.
right? Yeah, ACP. I see. You get lost pretty quickly trying to keep track of them, and everybody's got lots of different standards. But fundamentally, a standard is just an agreed upon way of exchanging information. It's not replacing what a person is doing to some extent. Last sort of serious question. Then I'd love to get some validation on this point. I have heard that no one's Googling anymore. The youth aren't Googling. A couple years ago, the youth weren't Googling because they were just doing all their search in TikTok. Okay. Now the youth aren't Googling because they are doing all their searching in ChatGPT. Isn't it kind of true that everyone is using LLMs now instead of searching for stuff?
I don't think we can trust any of the data that is coming out around that subject at this time. And I think the reason why I'm so skeptical about that is because they are adding it to every enterprise app under the sun. And it is being added to the heart of all of our mobile devices. And it's being added to everything, search, everything. So, I mean, we've known for a long time in marketing that, people don't like to scroll beyond the first third of the page, below the fold. And so that is the golden real estate. Well, all that's been shifted over multiple tabs, and the golden real estate is the answer engine that the AI is generating, which means that now the game is trying to figure out how to get yourself into that. So when people talk about how everyone is using LLMs, that's because it's the default. So if it's, the customers are being asked to use this and they choose to use it, that's one thing. But if it's the convenient option because it's the default shoved in their faces, we all know. We have always known, and it's always centered around search, Aaron. Like the whole debacle with Internet Explorer back in the day, right?
Oh
Like
wow.
right? Like the browser wars, right? It was because that was the default. So people just stuck with it. We've known this for a really long time. And so use that same skepticism and knowledge of tech history when thinking critically about these AI topics and the stats associated. Another thing I really want to put on people's radar is be really picky about the distinction between discovery and commerce, because while discovery is certainly a part of commerce, particularly on the B2C side, obviously commerce is a lot more, right? Because discovery usually happens near the top of the funnel, and commerce, even in the B2C sense, is way at the bottom.
Definitionally is the bottom of the funnel. Yes.
Absolutely. And so, you can't fix the problems at the top of the funnel by completely rerouting what's going on at the bottom. And that's kind of the leap in logic that's going on with a lot of this conversation that conflates discovery and commerce. And I'm not going to name names, but if you look at my LinkedIn feed, you will see that I've been pretty critical of reports coming from certain organizations that are in the consulting world that do this prolifically on some of their most often recirculated reports, and it is maddening.
Well, are we sure that the LLM didn't write the report? I think
I'm
they
sure it wrote a huge
large.
chunk of it, honestly.
Yeah.
It's not this, it's that.
Right. M dash M dash M dash. Well, Heather, we're going to find out, I suppose, pretty quickly if the skepticism is warranted, if your predictions or anti predictions come true or don't come true, depending on what they are. And so we should probably revisit this conversation in, say, 12 months and see, like, what is the state of agentic AI in commerce? Have the robots come for us all and turn us into nutrient paste? Or are people still around and flourishing with bespoke AI tools, or are we thriving? Who knows? There's only one possible way to find out, and that will be to listen to this podcast. Well, I have one last question for you that I ask all of the guests, and if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know what's coming, and if you haven't, this will be a glorious surprise. But I always ask for one piece of media that you have consumed in the last few months that you would recommend to people. And sometimes this is a book, could be a novel, could be a nonfiction book, could be a podcast, could be a TV show, could be a movie, a play, an opera, interpretive dance, whatever you want, a piece of art, a piece of media that you like and would recommend to other people. This is not graded, so you don't have to give a very sort of like propeller head answer that is extra credit, but you can certainly if you want to. What do you have for the guests, Heather?
It's not very nerdy. I've been getting into cooking more of my own food lately, and so, I think the most recent purchase and media consumption on my part has been from, America's Test Kitchen. I got a cookbook about Mediterranean food, and I'm so stoked. I need to make lamb moussaka and all these other things. I am not necessarily the world's best, knife expert, but I'm sure that I will find plenty of excuses to try to refine those skills as I experiment.
Well, I'm not especially because you did this motion, and so I don't know, like, I agree with you, like, that you are not the foremost like, I would be nervous around you with a knife just based on the hand gesture that you made. But no, America's Test Kitchen, Mediterranean cooking, I think that sounds amazing. Next time we meet, if you could bring hummus, that would be fantastic. We love a good hummus at Oro. Well, really appreciate you coming on the podcast to sort of like reignite 2026 for us. And reignite is not our code word for the year. It's just a word I chose. But I think this was a good level setting for all of our audience for the B2B Uncut podcast. Where can people you've mentioned it, but we're going to ask again because a lot of people skip to the end or they listen to it 2x speed. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
I'm on LinkedIn. So Heather Hershey 1, super easy, and it's spelled just like the candy bar. And yes, I am related, but I didn't inherit anything from that.
Not even a bar of chocolate.
No,
That's
they'll
unfortunate.
if you go to Hershey's Chocolate World, though, they give everyone a chocolate bar at the entrance.
Everyone can be special at Hershey's Chocolate World and at Heather Hershey's LinkedIn feed. Thank you so much, Heather. Really appreciate it. This was a blast as always. We will talk later. And as I said, we will revisit this in a year to see whether or not humanity still exists. Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for listening. Goodbye.